Hello, everyone, and I really appreciate your attendance. I'm one of the two people that are ownership of the company that's putting on the show today, and we're very passionate about education and making sure that the information gets out. And it tends to be the collaboration in these types of settings is very nice to be able to not only learn from the experts, but also talk amongst each other. I actually had a 502 Tier 3 grow and processing in Washington back in 2014, but I've since transitioned into this realm to help communicate and collaborate. So this particular session is about selling hemp within the recreational cannabis retail market. I know a lot of people are looking for ways to move their hemp, and quite clearly this is one option. I do want to introduce Pete Danko, who's in the middle here. He joined the Pittsburgh. I'm from Pittsburgh, but from the Portland Business Journal in 2016. And originally he was to cover natural resources and energy. And at that point, cannabis was a very small portion of his job, but quite clearly there's been a huge evolution over the years, and the importance of cannabis in the community has grown. So he is now very focused on providing updates and informational pieces about the industry, whether it be the traditional recreational medical market and then also the hemp market. And with that, there's a lot of interest that's grown in the general public to learn more about it. So he's here today to be able to talk and moderate between our two other speakers representing Washington and also representing the state of Oregon.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. It's great to be here, and I'll start off by thanking all of you who are in the industry for providing an endlessly fascinating sector to cover. It's been, as Michelle alluded to, it's been a surprise to us at the Business Journal how much interest there's been among our readers. People tend to think of them as Portland Business Alliance, conservative, but they have seen, I think, that this is a real business and it has real and substantial impact in Oregon, and I don't know Washington as well, but we'll learn more about Washington today. This past year was an amazing year for hemp and hemp coverage, and we'll talk about a lot of the varied issues that came up in the course of the year, regulatory issues and legal issues. But I thought we'd start off by trying to answer that first question that this panel is titled on, and that is literally what you are able to do as a hemp grower in the recreational market in your state, whether you're in Oregon or Washington. So we have the two chief regulators for the recreational marijuana programs in Oregon and Washington, Steve Marks and Rick Garza. And we'll start off with Rick to talk about what the rules are and the possibilities are in Washington for hemp growers, processors, whatever your business is, for interacting with the recreational marijuana sector.
So good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. I can't see anybody, so I usually would stand, but let me share one thing. Someone said we're experts. Let me tell you, I'm not an expert about hemp and CBD, and it's really fairly new. Just in the discussions I just had before we walked in here, there's a lot more activity in Oregon than Washington. Just because I'm interested, people from Washington who have licenses in Washington or in both states, just so I know how many are here. A few. Okay. So let me start with one thing, because I want to back up into what you can do with respect to hemp, which is basically CBD in our rec market. Think of the irony of the fact that we're trying to get a safe harbor banking bill out of the U.S. Senate right now, and we can't get that to move. Yet, interesting enough, a former U.S. Senate Majority Leader decided that we were going to legalize hemp. So to me, it's just kind of the dysfunction of people not recognizing that cannabis is cannabis and the politics that happens there. But I would just say, as an editorial, we need a banking bill out of the Congress to allow this industry to do what everyone else does, which is bank. And so I just think it's ironic that that happened through the Farm Bill with the provision that allows hemp to be grown, yet we don't have some of the things that we need, some of the things that really make sense. And we've been to D.C., a number of us from Washington, to talk with our congressional delegation and others about moving forward and removing prohibition, especially as it relates to capital assets and banking and other financing that the business should have the right to be involved in. So we're pretty small with respect to, and I can tell you, we have very little authority, the Liquor and Cannabis Board, over hemp. That was done purposely. It's the Department of Agriculture that issues permits. To this point, has issued around 175 permits, pretty small. 30 licensees that grow cannabis in our marketplace also have permits to grow. And really, it's been problematic, but it created a lot of discussions with the Department of Ag about how do people coexist, which is a question, because again, cannabis is cannabis, right? And so I think what I would say is a lot of the work that we've had the last few months is trying to figure out, because what WSDA is doing is just simply providing a permit that allows you to grow. What happens with that byproduct, the processing that occurs, is not regulated, right? And then we have this other situation where the only thing in Washington is CHABA, which if you know is cosmetic and beauty aids. Topicals are allowed by law in our marketplace, the legal marketplace, and in that which is not regulated. So Walgreens and the rest of them also sell CHABA products. And then, as you know, CBD is being sold just about everywhere, and much of it unregulated, and certainly unregulated in our marketplace also. But I think what's important is, and I don't know what the percentages are here, most of the folks that are getting permits in Washington to grow hemp are extracting to CBD. That's probably 98% of the marketplace right now. That's where it's going. That's why they want to do it, so they can get into the CBD market. I don't know if that's different than what's going on in Oregon, but that's pretty much what people are doing in Washington. But as you can see, with the number of licenses and permits that have been issued by the Department of Ag, there's not a lot of activity that's going on compared to what's happening here in Oregon.
So can those folks who have the hemp permits, can they sell into your regulated marijuana market?
So we're in the process with a bill that's being introduced, because right now CBD has to have trace elements of THC in it, because in our stores, the only thing you can sell is cannabis or cannabis-related product, and that definition is met by a small percentage of THC in it. So there's a bill that's being passed right now that would allow for not only CHABA products, but all CBD products be sold at retail. I think one of the discussions that we're having right now is, should it go under the same testing regimes that other product has in that store? What does that do? The cost? And I think that's a big debate right now. Should it be tested in the same way that other product is being tested? And I suspect you all have different opinions with respect to that. I think our thought is, why wouldn't it be under the same regime as other product that's being sold? But we're open to hear why that might not need to be the case.
And so, Steve, what's the situation in Oregon?
Well, thanks, and thanks for being here, Rick. I really appreciate you coming down to Oregon and sharing your perspectives with us. You know, this industry is pretty incredible here. It's 65,000 acres in Oregon, and as Pete said, really blown up. And the economic contribution of that to the long-term future of the state is going to be, substantial in the cannabis world. I just, by way of describing our system, think we'll just do a little historical vignette that many of you will remember. When we got cannabis responsibilities, right, we were uncertain about whether hemp products were going to be in the marijuana stores. Initially, we said yes, and then some FDA guidance came out, DEA, and we said no. You fought very hard, the industry did, to get approvals and packaging to come into the OLCC system with your hemp products. So we allowed that to happen, the commission did. And then there was legislation, right, that looked at how hemp actually was intersecting with the new marijuana system, and there was a run on bringing product in that was less successful, and then a successful run where you could elect to send lots of your product in, get it, enroll it in tracking and metric, make it go through all the same testing as marijuana, and then pick a stream of marketing in the stores that was either hemp as a hemp product, or if it was mixed with marijuana, it became part of a marijuana product in our stores. Hemp has become in part an enforcement issue as well with the agency as you look, because all of your uses, all of the product types except for high levels of THC are pretty identical to marijuana products, and that's become an issue. We all know about the Idaho truckload that got pulled over and interdicted for a time. But we have a lot of enforcement issues that are taking place because of the look-alike nature. So there's been this love affair between marijuana and hemp and cannabis plant. And I'll say, when our market got tough, when our licensing became slower, a lot of our growers went over and produced hemp, and it was a savior, I think, for the industry that was struggling at the time, that had made plans to grow marijuana, and they could go over to the hemp market as long as you kept those operations all separate, and I think you know about those. So it's been an interesting experience, and I think we're reaching a new day with the requirements now with the Farm Bill passing and its allowance and the state plans on looking at how we regulate the cannabis plant in its various parts.
So you both have made a point that it is all the same plant, and so does that mean that even if nothing happens federally, legalization of THC cannabis, is that what we should call it? By the way, what kind of terminology should we use? I know that I don't like the term marijuana. I know a lot of people don't like the term marijuana. I'm just curious what people think. Is it THC cannabis versus hemp? Yeah. Any thoughts? Yeah, Bo Whitney likes that idea. If Bo likes it, I'll go with that. So even if nothing happens federally, what are we likely to see at the state level when it comes to regulating that plant, the whole array? Are we likely to see developments either this year in the legislatures? I think Rick alluded to some things that might be happening there. Steve, what do you see in Oregon coming up?
Well, I think Sonny was here just before and talked about some of the things that they're looking for in forming a commodity commission and helping us match up or have exceptions to the way Oregon is going to find its way through federal planning. So that looks very clear. In terms of the issues that are out there, I can tell you that tracking both in-state for transport is becoming an important issue to law enforcement generally, both in-state and in interstate commerce. I think the vape issue and lung illness, and have always put scrutiny over any hemp vape product that is just like the marijuana product, except for, or the THC cannabis product. Putting the same scrutiny on them because, the additives, the other component parts, even if you're doing all of your work and matching our standards to be in the general marketplace for consumption, ingestion consumption is an important issue, and I think that's something that the legislature and the industry are going to have to come to terms with is how do some of these things that you do, similar to the way we regulate marijuana for consumers, need to be presented to the consumer market so they have more assurances of what are in the products. Now, I know in Oregon, we've got a better history than I think the rest of the world in terms of thinking about testing and certification of products that are going out in the marketplace. But obviously, the hemp side of the equation is lagging behind our highly regulated, high THC marijuana system. So I think that's going to be a poignant issue for the industry. But and on the other hand, it's one that I think can distinguish Oregon producers in a nationalized marketplace.
And what about in Washington, Rick?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. The question was asked about cannabis. I tend to believe that cannabis is cannabis, and you're making a distinction between hemp and THC potent cannabis. I mean, that it's interesting because we're highly regulated too. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And yet you've got a hemp product regulated by the Department of Agriculture. The only testing that's occurring is whether it meets a potency above the THC limit, so it has to be destroyed, so it can't move forward. No other regulations impact that industry. And so I'm not suggesting that it should, but you can see there's a real difference between how we set up this system 7 years ago and where we are now with hemp, and trying to figure out what that looks like. You know, you have discussions with the Department of Ag, and they say, we treat it like any other commodity. Because I was thinking up front when we met with them the first time, well, what are you going to do? You're going to regulate the process, the growth, the processing, where it goes. You're going to track it. You're going to put it in a system. I said, absolutely not. That's not what we do with apples. All we do is give you a license or a permit to grow the apples. There's other departments that get involved in other aspects of it. So you can see already you're creating one system that's not regulated much to one that is. And I think that's the part that we have to grapple with, and we need you to give us input on that and review that to what should it look like when it enters our marketplace. 'Cause I think the struggle right now from the industry that's regulated is it should be treated like other product. It should be tested like other product. And I'm not convinced that it should or it shouldn't be. But that's a discussion right now that we're having in a proposal that's before the legislature to allow all CBD products to be sold in our retail market. And in fact, what the industry is asking for is to allow the FDA, when it does its rulemaking, to determine what should be done with this product. And you know, the FDA is probably we're gonna hear from them maybe in like a year or longer. It'll be long. As you all know, there were hearings last fall and winter where hundreds of business got up to share their experience and the fact that they were selling CBD products. But I suspect the FDA will take some time, and who knows what they'll come up with as far as the regulations. So I guess it leaves us as a state agency wondering, should we step in and create some regulation around that? And be interested when we have Q&A to hear from you. What do you think? Where should that lie? Somewhere in the middle or not? Or strictly regulated like other product that we sell through our system?
So, Steve, one of the issues that you alluded to was confusion about law enforcement confusion about hemp versus THC cannabis. Is that an issue for your agency, for your inspectors, and as you guys are policing, if that's the word, the industry?
It's really been less an issue for us and our inspectors as it has more been for law enforcement, that they don't know what this is when it's on the road, right? And there's no quick test for THC content, so it's really the certification you can show on that. And I think law enforcement really would like to have something that they could rely upon when you're transporting hemp, that it's hemp and they can look at it and believe in it. And interstate commerce and in-state commerce can readily occur, but that is definitely an issue. We see a lot of look-alike products, and I think the industry's all heard about, through the Port of Portland, whenever they're confiscating hemp going out and testing it, the bulk of that is testing higher on THC limits. We know the practicalities of producing hemp, right? No matter how hard and what you do when you have that field test, you're probably going to get some residual THC growth. Some people are talking about a 1% limit on that. Somehow we need a way to better distinguish these products in the marketplace. And I think that's an issue right within the Farm Bill, right? I know there's the debate about can you have hot hemp for a while and how do you deal with it and how do you process that and not having it confiscated. Well, this falls into this one plant notion, right? You also have residual THC waste, which is not insignificant, and you're in a legal state. Why isn't that marketable and just waste in a state where THC is actually legal? So I think this certification of the testing of the cannabis plant and the clarity that we can put around how you're presenting it to the marketplace is probably the look that we need to be able to see. How we do that, how long it takes us to do that, how that works within a federal system that really has defined our bifurcated system, right? The test on hemp came out in the field at 0.3. Well, why is that? It's really set us down this path of dividing up this plant in a way that doesn't harmonize with high THC intoxicants and a look-alike substance and lower quality hemp produced or cannabis produced for CBD and CBDG and all its component parts.
Okay. So as we move forward, FDA, Rick alluded to the FDA. I think you gave them a little more credit than they deserve, Rick. I think it was May or June that they had their hearing on CBD, and I know there's been a lot of pressure from politicians for them to do something, but there doesn't really seem to be any indication that is happening. So is it going to be, do you think that the states are going to, do you anticipate Washington stepping in and putting some kind of regimen in place on CBD?
Well, I think we're just starting a legislative session. We're in the midst of discussing that. I think it's probably more likely that we would than we wouldn't, to be honest with you. And the enforcement issue, I just think with respect to that, we do get calls from enforcement, or enforcement gets calls from law enforcement. I mean, we can find out whether they have a permit. It seems to me it would make sense that they have a manifest if they're transporting hemp, so that it's clear that they have the right to do that and that they're permitted by the state. And typically that permit process and the plan's been approved by the feds, but I know that's been happening differently in the states. But I don't know why we would not try to track it as we do other products so that we don't have issues with respect to law enforcement. So I wanted to address that. But I think, I suspect the FDA will take forever, and then there'll be political pressure that probably won't put a lot of teeth around the regulations, to be honest with you. That's what we've seen before. And again, there's lots of, we don't even have a legal product nationwide right now. So I think there's, I just don't sense there's going to be a lot there. So I suspect we'll need to work with the industry to figure out how far do we need to go and how much regulation do we need around the product.
Steve, do you think there's a possibility that hemp will be tracked in the way that THC cannabis is in Oregon?
I definitely think the FDA is going to be looking at tracking hemp and hemp products and their production, in part because of its relationship to marijuana itself, in part because and you're aware of the consternation in maybe some states that don't have the same kind of values that Oregon has about the Farm Bill really opening up hemp, and it's really confounded their sense about what they want to do about marijuana prosecutions, and they're having trouble proving what the substance is, and that prosecutors in some states, at least you read it in the press, right, aren't making prosecutions because it's expensive to do the testing to figure that out. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's happening. And I think the values of some states that really don't embrace this new cannabis world are problematic. When Rick and I meet with cannabis regulators and have regularly, their concerns about CBDs and hemp products with their system, they're struggling like we are, and I can assure you that they don't have all the values of it being a wide open product on the consumer market. So I do think we will see tracking, and I think the leadership that at least the states from the West, I think, can provide is to help. And since the FDA, I think, is going to be forever in promulgating its rules, is help to pioneer some of those systems and rationalize them so they work for the development of this industry.
Okay. I'm sure I could continue to throw questions at these guys, but one of the things that I've found in this industry is it moves very fast, and those of us up here, at least me, I don't often know what's going on out there in your world. So I'd love it if folks have questions or comments related to these topics. I'd say let's open it up to that. Go ahead.
Hi, I am Dr. Adi Ray. My team and I produce a cannabis competition, the Cultivation Classic. So in years past, it's been largely, type 1 THC dominant flowers, but we're expanding our hemp category massively this year. One of the reasons for that is that we, in our data, we collect data in a randomized double-blind fashion over the course of 30 days. So it's essentially a phase 1 clinical trial, but for recreation. So what we've found in our data is that there's a difference between enjoyment and intoxication, and that the consumer perception that THC is the valuable component of the plant, we're hoping to use our data to differentiate that. Steve, something that you said really resonated with me, which is, what do we do with all this hot hemp, all this craft hemp, all of this flower that is useless for the hemp market and also useless for the THC market? And from a public health perspective, from a harm reduction perspective, that's exactly the kind of plant that should be mass produced as like the Coors Light of recreation. So what our team would like to see, in addition to more hemp flowers in the cup, and what our team would like to see is a pathway, a regulatory pathway for all of those, hot hemp, heady hemp flowers to make it into the OLCC market.
So really an interesting concept, and I think it's the practical approach that we've got to look at as we're allowing the growing of this plant in just two different ways, and it doesn't make sense to me that we don't harmonize in this state the way we treat the plant. If you'll remember when the ballot measure was passing and people, when we were first crafting our rules, the marijuana industry said, we're going to produce the CBDs out of the marijuana plants. It's going to have low THC. That's where our market was initially heading. And then, this developing hemp market sort of supplanted it and I'd argue took that over. So we do have the equity issues then about how we regulated both our our low acreage, highly regulated, high THC cannabis OLCC system versus more loosely regulated for some design values in the marketplace, but not clear how it's hitting it. So I welcome ideas around that. I think that's exactly what Oregon ought to be thinking about and pioneering, because I do think the FDA is going to take forever, and the extent that we can bring some cogent public policy thought to that integration of, presenting this plan in the marketplace in the way it should is valuable.
Interesting. I'm going off in a different place, but there's a couple of bills that were introduced in Washington, one to tax by potency level with respect to THC, the other to not allow vape pens above 10% THC. Consider that. I mean, that's drastic. So I'm hearing, I guess it would be good to learn more, because I think that's the whole drive, last time I was here, in our marketplace, to the highest THC of everything. of every product that's available. Just give me the stuff that's got the highest potency. Very little education with consumers about, do you really need that? You can probably have a much better experience doing this a little differently. So be interested in your thoughts about that. But I just think we've got to do a better job, and especially with the public health and prevention community hammering away at us, to be honest with you, that look what the market has become and what have you done. And I've pressed the industry a lot with respect to this. Do you see the long-term effect of this, where we're seeing, and some of the issues we're seeing with respect to psychosis that's been happening for 3 or 4 years? We got to be real honest. Everybody wants to be honest about cannabis. We got to be honest about potency and how we educate the consumer around this product. And product that's available today was not available 20 years ago, 30 years ago, with respect to potency. It seems to be something that's really happened in the last 10 to 15 years, basically since the medical initiatives were passed in '98 in our state. Things began to change. And then with the advent of legalization for adult use, just everything has changed with respect to product. And it follows the consumer. That's what happens with commodities. It's not surprising, but it seems like we've got to be real careful, both as a regulator in the industry, to not allow ourselves to be vulnerable to the attacks, that the only thing you care about is making the money and we provide the consumer what they want without any lens about public health and safety around it. So I appreciated your comments.
Absolutely. And, my academic job is in harm reduction, and I'm a neuroscientist. And from the harm reduction and public health perspective, there are a lot of misaligned incentives where, the intake managers and wholesalers and retailers and cultivators are all aware that the superior agricultural products are the ones that aren't those 30% frankenflowers necessarily. Some of them are beautiful, but from a public health perspective, you're exactly right. The psychosis issue, the cannabis use disorder, the hyperemesis, all of those risks are most closely related to potency. But trying to get those individuals who are making their money off of potency to fund a public awareness campaign, that's a very misaligned incentive. So it really is up to the regulators. It's up to those universities. It's up to the institutions to put up billboards all around Seattle and Portland that say, you're too high, and begin the conversation about what the difference is between intoxication and enjoyment, because there's plenty of room for enjoyment below a level that poses risks public health-wise.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Kelly Ritter. I used to do medical years ago, and it was those CBD THC blends that got me into the industry anyway, because we were dealing with Parkinson's issues, multiple sclerosis issues, bipolar issues, and it's the flavonoids and cannabinoids that I think we really need to be researching. At this time, we're looking at a legislative session again, and the Ways and Means and Joint Ways and Means committees are really the way to affect change in our systems. One of the problems that I have as a recreational grower was the time it took to get my hemp license through OLCC. No problem. I had a week, and Sonny had it right here. I was doing great. But I could not get responses from your office. I could not get things approved, and it was July 15th. So I planted on the other side of the fence, that fence I had to pay for way back when I started, that isn't now even necessary. And now I've got a violation. So how can I effectively help you help me make this easier transition?
Well, I'm not sure I can get you out of a violation, but I do see your position.
Leland's on it.
But there's no doubt that we've had trouble. Our licensing process has gotten bogged down and slow, and there's no doubt about it. Our recent rules.
Do you need more people?
It's not just more people for all of it, but we do need more people. That would definitely help. Part of it was the IT system that we put in place for licensing didn't deal with renewals and put us behind. A part of it was that the legislature wasn't interested in giving us a lot of people initially, and then they came up with a moratoria on the producer side. Some of that had to do with supply and the dynamics that were going on there, arguably about where we were, a year ago. So we do need more people. We need to get a better licensing system. I think the rules we put in place recently will help us. They provide more certainty, more guidelines. So if you're getting up in the queue, you better be ready and know what you're doing so that we can push you out the door. If you're not, we'll push you in a hold, and we'll let those other people who are ready spend their time with our licensing personnel to get the applications done. That will definitely help with the speed. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but it should make it better. So a combination of all those things. It's going to be a while before we have a licensing system in place. We are just getting ready to begin to go out for the RFP on that, and that's going to take a while. So I think we're 2 years before we see that.
It's been a slow and painful process, and it's been a learning curve for the entire industry.
Yeah.
But I had to do something in order to make money and keep my farm.
Yeah.
Because it's us business people, it's us farmers that are out there on the front line, been doing this for a while. And it's our bread and butter and how I feed my children. So anything I can do this legislative session to help you get this through and make this streamlined process any more effective, let me know.
Thank you.
Tim?
Hi, I'm Tim Shaughnessy, and I think as producers and processors, we all feel your pain here in Oregon. But my question to you, Steve Marks, is in particular, are you having conversations with Rick, and are you having conversations with your counterparts in California? And at some point, are we going to see reciprocity between our states? How do we start doing business across state lines? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. I feel like being in the West and being Oregon, probably, Rick's got a little more. He started off with a more contained system than we did. California's system has nothing. They need big corrections to get that aligned, and I think that really hurt the movement for interstate commerce because they haven't got their compliant system moving up in terms of licenses. They're working very hard. We haven't really spent as much time with California as regulators as we'd like to because they've been so busy working on their system. But Rick and I and the West Coast states with Colorado have been meeting regularly, looking at how we harmonize regulations, how we prepare for a system of commerce that makes sense. And we've had discussions about, brought forward, Rick was nice enough to serve on a panel with me at the National Conference of State Liquor Administrators, where we began to talk about these ideas as, we have interstate commerce around alcohol that's very convoluted, and what's going to happen with cannabis, and shouldn't we start thinking and planning for what that might look like. So we introduced those ideas to the world. And then you have the Oregon bill that we're actually going to look for input from not just within the state on how export might be set up, but also to ask for comments from all those regulators that are now meeting on a full-time basis. And Rick, you might just want to talk a little bit more about the interest of the regulatory community we've got coming
So
down.
you might be surprised to learn that your regulator's a trendsetter. So that export bill that you all passed last year was interesting because we've been regulating alcohol just as Steve has in Washington for over 80 years. And reciprocity was the first way that wineries could sell to one another or sell into other states because the three-tier tied house laws didn't allow that. So reciprocity makes sense. I don't remember who the gentleman is that raised it. But the idea I thought that you all had of being ready when prohibition is lifted to allow for exports immediately, I was kind of jealous because I told Steve, go, dang, you're going to be ready. Because what'll happen when it opens up, all the states will do what you did with the export market. They're going to want to create that ability for you to go nationwide. And why wouldn't you with your brands and everything else? So I think he's pretty forward-looking. So you're aware, we get caught up in these licensing and enforcement issues. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, about what we're doing in Washington around that. But Steve, the West, interesting enough, and shouldn't be surprising, first 4 states to legalize adult use were Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Alaska. And the first meeting of the regulators 3 years ago in April was those 4 states. And we just met recently in Maryland, and there were 27 states, Canada, 3 provinces, and local jurisdictions who were invited also. So we've been meeting every 6 months, and of course, because of Steve's leadership, we're hosting, Portland is hosting the next Cannabis Regulators Roundtable. And that's really what we're doing to the question about best practices, model regulations, and legislation. We only have 2.5 days. We cover everything you could possibly think of. We have different national speakers come in to share. The last meeting we had, we pick a topic, was public health and prevention. We wanted to hear specifically from national agencies, departments, and then also other state entities that are in public health and prevention. And we talked about some of the issues I was just talking about. But yeah, the idea, and we're actually in Portland looking at forming an association, a formal association of the regulators. So we do talk a lot. And Jim Burrick from Colorado, Steve and I, and Erica, who was with Alaska until she took on a new job, have spent a lot of time over the years. We don't want to do what the alcohol industry did, where all of the states have totally different regulations and laws. And it's a mess for the industry and the alcohol industry to figure out. And of course, they're national, international companies that I've got to hire people in each state to be compliant, rather than uniform model legislation and regulations that say, we're going to be consistent in how we regulate this marketplace. Because what I think is national prohibition is going to take some time to be lifted. It's not going to happen as quick as I think it should. I don't think it will. So the states are going to be moving. What I suspect is, and it's Steve's idea, that a commission be formed of the regulators of cannabis that are legal to help the federal government understand when prohibition is lifted, how will it occur? What will the states, and it may be an alcohol model where the states' rights are bigger than the federal government. And in alcohol, the states have more rights through the 21st Amendment to set regulation above what the feds do. It might be a model that works for cannabis. Steve actually has a paper he's written about it. But I would say we're making every effort to spend as much time as we can together to create similar systems that make sense and begin after 7 years now. It's hard to imagine. It's been 7 years since Colorado and Washington legalized. At the time that this happened, you know what? I'm going to stop because we've got people who want to ask questions.
Thank you. Brad Zussman with Mellow Vibes and Green Valley Chocolates here in Oregon. Question is for both Steve and Rick. I have part of a manufacturing facility where I'm in a change of ownership right now here in Oregon. And we're also in the process of getting ready to build a second CBD manufacturing facility to be able to do creams, tinctures, topicals, edibles. My question to both of you would be, I am all for the metrics in the CBD side. If we were able to have a process put in place where a open market CBD kitchen is able to go through the regulations, get the metrics, all the compliance, everything that is needed, will the states be open to being able to get those products that are manufactured in those facilities into the THC stores, whether it's Washington, California, Oregon? And on top of that, when we look at the labels that are applied to the different types of packaging, will we have some type of a universal symbol or code to be able to allow the hemp products to be able to flow through to the recreational stores? And then in addition to that, would the recreational manufacturing facilities be able to manufacture CBD for the open market if they are also following the same type of rules, because then you get into the crossover where you actually have a THC component in the facility as well as a CBD component, and then you have the possibility of getting the cross-contamination or a mix-up and stuff like that. And I would love to get some type of clarification, because building these facilities costs hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars to be able to do. And it would be great if you could have a CBD kitchen on one side, a THC on another one, and be able to universally push packaging equipment into the middle to be able to package both, versus having to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to duplicate the same thing in the same facility.
Before Steve answers, I want to just jump in and say we've already got THC and CBD together. I mean, there was the case in Lynn County that I'm sure many of you heard about, where a processor was charged with manufacture of marijuana product because they went into their facility, the authorities went into the facility and found a product that during the processing process had gone over the line, and they deemed that a marijuana product. And of course, as you've alluded to, Steve, there's THC that has to be remediated from hemp products already. So they're already together, so it makes perfect sense to put in place some kind of way for them to coexist, more clear way for them to coexist. Anyway.
So I'll answer from my perspective, which won't help you a bit politically, right? I'm just an administrator. I have a commission that takes a vote. The legislature looks at these things. But I think that's what I'm talking about. It makes perfect sense to have integrated production, processing, and management, so long as, and I think we need to work on, how we test and certify that the components that come out in packaging are in fact those low CBD products or that high THC products. And I think, you know, our industry around cannabis is going to increasingly be delineated by our ability to have faith in, if not more than faith in science, and what it is presented to the marketplace, that it's accurate, that we have the right disclaimers, that we have the right numerical values on there for what exists here, and that it doesn't have things in it that aren't supposed to be there.
I agree completely.
I think we can do one more, maybe? Okay. Sorry.
All right, so I'm a grower out of Washington, so these questions are for you, Rick. You mentioned a percentage of THC to sell in a recreational cannabis retail. Is there a specific limit, or is it just some THC?
0.3.
0.3? Okay, interesting. And then if you are looking to sell in current regulations and recommendations in a recreational cannabis retail with hemp, should you follow the regulations that exist for products that are already going in that retail? Or can you get away with not doing that? What's your recommendation?
Well, that's the debate right now.
Okay.
And I wouldn't know. I want to have that discussion with, inside our organization, and then with licensees also, to figure out what that should be. I tend to think, just from what we just heard, that it should be some regulation. But let me share, like when you talk about traceability, the traceability system we created 5 years ago, the traceability system I would create today would be very, very different. Wineries, when they report their production, and they pay their taxes on the 20th of the month. We created these systems that are very complicated, very difficult, very expensive, because you know what happened 7 years ago? We were worried the DOJ was going to move against the system. So we created a very strict system for licensure, for enforcement, for traceability. We had to live up to the Cole memo. Remember, that came 9 months after legalization in Colorado and Washington. I'll be honest with you, we were just about ready to issue licenses. We didn't have any guidance from the feds that we were going to be allowed to move forward. That is a totally different world than we live in today, where we have 11 states with DC, and we have all but 3 states in the country that have not allowed some form of medical cannabis to be sold and provided to patients. Now, in the South and in the Midwest, it's very strict. Proponents don't believe it's legal, but it is legal and very strict. The point of that being that why I'm saying that is, we've got to recalibrate. We call it Cannabis 2.0 in our state. We've got to look at how we put the system together and back up and be more responsive to the needs of business, because my God, if I were you, I'd be strangling under the regulations that we put in place in our state. We did that to keep the system in place, to keep it legal. It was very strict, but we're looking at our enforcement practices. We're looking at a lot of things in our state right now, and we need to look at this differently. We need to say things have changed substantially in the last 7 years. We need to back up a little bit and assist our licensees.
Thanks. Great questions. I wish we could take more. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Before we do wrap up, I know that Steve wanted to talk about, we have this connection between the hemp and marijuana regulatory structures, but there's also a connection between the hemp and the alcoholic beverages regulatory structures. So let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah, so let me get to that. I want to just build off a couple things that Rick talked about in closing here. Rick did, that scheme we put in place responsive to the Cole Memorandum, and Rick's system went earlier than Oregon's system. I think we're a little better, but one of the things that we did, and is that a little better because we had the experience of looking at what they did in Colorado, particularly around packaging. It was a huge advantage to us to see their experience in starting that out. So two things. One is, as Rick is looking at making changes to their program, we need to look at changes to ours. We have, we put penalties in. They're all Category 1, and we settle them, and we try to rationalize it, and it works. It's not very good for you. I don't think it's very equitable, but we make it equitable by sort of hitting our standards. I know there's going to be sort of what I call a safe harbor legislation or amendment introduced in this session. I got to tell you, I've thought we've needed that kind of system for a while, so we can go out and on those non-major violations, if you request, if you're a licensee on our marijuana side, if you request that we come out and look with you, we can look at your operations for those things that are not diversion, taking cash to cartels, selling to minors, that, we can do the fix-it ticket. And if you get it fixed, then you don't have a violation. That, I think, supports a more efficient operation for us. And I think that's a great discussion for OLCC to have, for legislation to give us some authorization to work with the industry to do that. Yeah, we're about done. And then on CBD and alcohol, for those of you that are concerned with it, we regulate alcohol as well. We needed to be, I think, have fidelity to the law on both sides. So we did put restrictions in. Those restrictions are intended to match state law. So it's an adulterant, but you better have your certificate of analysis if it's in the marketplace. And for manufacturing, we probably went broad on hemp because we wrote a cannabis-based regulation, and it got beyond CBDs to some of the other components of hemp that we would prohibit in the manufacture of alcohol. We're going to come back and make a change to that and just simply say something like, or as otherwise approved by TTB, which is the federal entity that certifies, that Oregon relies on for the certification of alcohol. So we went a little broad. We're going to dial that back a bit, but all of that was intended for us to make sure that bars, our own liquor agents, all complied with existing state law.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think they're ready to kick us out. Thanks a lot, everybody.